The September afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with that peculiar golden quality that made even the most somber occasions seem touched by an almost unseemly beauty. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in the third pew from the back of St. Mary's Church, observed the gathering with the gentle attention she might have given to a particularly intricate piece of needlework. The funeral of Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth had drawn a respectable crowd, considering the deceased had become something of a recluse in her final years. The church smelled of damp hymnals, beeswax, and the faint, persistent scent of chrysanthemums arranged with military precision along the nave. Miss Marple's keen blue eyes, often mistaken for merely benign, took in the familiar faces with quiet interest. There was Dr. Haydock, looking unusually grave, his usual cheerful demeanor subdued by the solemnity of the occasion. Beside him sat Major Burnaby, whose mustache twitched with what might have been suppressed emotion or merely the effects of the church's stuffiness. Mrs. Price Ridley, resplendent in a hat that could have sheltered a small family, occupied her customary position near the front, her expression suggesting she was already composing the detailed account she would share at the next Women's Institute meeting. The deceased woman's nephew, Geoffrey Ashworth, cut a distinguished figure in his well-tailored morning coat, though Miss Marple noticed he kept consulting his pocket watch with what seemed unnecessary frequency. Behind him sat his wife, Patricia, whose grief appeared genuine enough, and their daughter, Rosaline, barely 18 and possessed of that particular beauty that comes from youth rather than artifice. The girl's downcast eyes seemed to dart occasionally toward a young man seated across the aisle, David Tremaine, the solicitor's son, whose frequent visits to the Ashworth household had not gone unnoticed by the village gossips. As the Reverend Mr. Clement's voice rose and fell in the familiar cadences of the burial service, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to a figure seated near the back of the church. A young woman, perhaps 25, with striking dark hair and an unusually composed expression for someone attending a funeral. She was not immediately recognizable as a village resident, and her clothes, while appropriate, had a certain metropolitan quality that marked her as an outsider. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was not the woman's appearance, but rather a sound that seemed quite out of place in the solemn atmosphere. As the congregation rose for a hymn, a soft, musical laugh, barely audible but unmistakably inappropriate, drifted from the young woman's direction. It was not a cruel laugh, Miss Marple noted with interest, but rather the sort of involuntary sound that might escape someone caught in a private moment of amusement. Several other mourners had noticed as well. Mrs. Price Ridley turned to stare with obvious disapproval, her hat quivering with indignation. Even the tolerant Dr. Haydock glanced back with a slight frown. The young woman seemed oblivious to the attention she was attracting, her gaze fixed on something beyond the immediate scene, that strange soft laughter continuing to bubble up at intervals like water from a hidden spring. Miss Marple found herself studying the girl with increasing fascination. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that behavior which seemed inexplicable often had the most revealing explanations. People did not, as a general rule, laugh at funerals without reason, and she wondered what particular memory or association might drive this attractive stranger to such an extraordinary display. As the service concluded and the congregation began to file out toward the churchyard, Miss Marple noticed the young woman fumbling with her handbag, a small, elegant affair that seemed somehow at odds with her otherwise modest attire. In her apparent haste to gather her belongings, several items scattered to the floor, a handkerchief, a small mirror, and what appeared to be a photograph. Without quite knowing why she did so, Miss Marple stepped forward to help retrieve the fallen items. The young woman accepted them with a grateful smile, but Miss Marple noticed she seemed particularly anxious to recover the photograph, snatching it up with rather more haste than seemed necessary. However, in her hurry, the girl had missed one item, a second photograph that had slipped beneath the pew. Miss Marple retrieved it, intending to return it to its owner, but as she glanced at the image, She paused. The photograph showed a much younger Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, perhaps in her 30s, standing beside a man Miss Marple didn't recognize. Both were smiling broadly, and there was something about their posture that suggested this was no casual acquaintance. More intriguingly, standing between them was a small child, a girl of perhaps 4 or 5 years, with the same dark hair as the young woman who had just hurried from the church. Someone had written on the back in faded ink, "Our darling Clara. May she always remember how much she was loved." Miss Marple stood for a moment in the now empty church, studying the photograph more closely. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs when the ordinary fabric of village life was about to be disturbed by some dramatic revelation. The girl who had laughed at Mrs. Ashworth's funeral was, she felt quite certain, about to provide St. Mary Mead with considerably more excitement than a simple burial service. With a thoughtful expression, Miss Marple slipped the photograph into her handbag and made her way toward the churchyard, where the final act of the funeral was about to commence. The procession moved slowly from the church to the graveside, the autumn air crisp and gentle, carrying with it the scents of turned earth and late-blooming roses. Miss Marple, her presence as unassuming as ever, followed at a respectful distance, observing the subtle eddies of emotion that swept through St. Mary Mead's mourners. Geoffrey Ashworth stood by the open grave, his face composed but his hand restless on his watch chain. Patricia leaned into him, her gloved fingers tight on his arm, while Rosalind, pale and silent, kept her eyes on the coffin, only occasionally darting glances toward David Tremaine at the edge of the gathering. The young woman whose laughter had so unsettled the congregation earlier kept to the fringes, her expression now schooled into composure. Miss Marple, practiced in the art of noticing what others missed, caught a fleeting look of something unresolved in the girl's eyes, a glimmer of pain or perhaps defiance, before she drifted away from the crowd, almost as if she belonged to another world. As the final prayers were spoken and the first handfuls of earth fell onto the casket, the village's voices began their customary work. Mrs. Price Ridley, settling her hat with a decisive tug, drew Major Burnaby aside. "That girl was positively disgraceful, did you see? Laughing. At Cordelia's funeral, no less. I shall write to the Gazette if Vicar doesn't address it." Major Burnaby, more interested in the promised sandwiches at the vicarage, grunted non-committally, while Mrs. Price Ridley's gaze lingered on Geoffrey, noting the impatience in his movements. Nearby, Dr. Haydock stood quietly, his eyes flicking between the family and the retreating figure of the mysterious girl. When Miss Marple approached, he greeted her with a nod. "A sad business, Miss Marple." Cordelia's heart finally gave out. "Still, I can't help but feel it was all rather sudden. She'd not been herself lately, but nothing that would have foretold this." His words carried a weight of unspoken thought, and Miss Marple filed them away with the care she gave to her knitting patterns. As the crowd began to disperse, shifting toward the vicarage tea, Miss Marple caught sight of the young woman again at the edge of the churchyard. Their paths crossed briefly. Miss Marple offered her a folded handkerchief, noting with a trained eye the faint pattern of old burns upon the girl's wrist, a detail quietly stored for later contemplation. The girl's thanks was soft, her glance quick and cool before she moved away, leaving behind the faintest trace of violets and a dropped glove, which Miss Marple tucked away with the photograph still hidden in her handbag. At the vicarage, Griselda Clement presided over the tea with her usual warmth, seeing to it that every plate was replenished and every guest made to feel at home. Conversation gathered in clusters, eddying around the edges of propriety and curiosity. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to let a mystery languish, probed the assembled company for any information about the laughing girl, who, it seemed, had vanished as quietly as she had arrived. "Not from the village, certainly," she declared, her voice pitched just loud enough for all to hear. "And did you know Mrs. Ashworth dismissed her companion only 3 weeks ago over a scene with an ivory box? so Mrs. Baker at the post office says. Major Burnaby, catching the tail end of this, murmured that women and their boxes were ever a source of trouble, while Dr. Haydock, overhearing, commented mildly, "Nerves make mountains of molehills, and sometimes the other way round." His eyes, though, betrayed a troubled curiosity, as if the events surrounding Cordelia Ashworth's death refused to settle comfortably in his mind. Geoffrey Ashworth, meanwhile, stood stiffly by the hearth, speaking in low tones to Mr. Tremaine, the solicitor. Patricia's graciousness fluttered as she positioned herself to prevent Rosalind and David from more than the briefest of exchanges, though the two young people managed, nonetheless, a moment of shared understanding, a glance filled with the unspoken solidarity of youth in the face of adult secrets. The atmosphere in the vicarage was thick with speculation, and as the tea wore on, Miss Marple quietly excused herself, the photograph in her handbag weighing more heavily with each step. She took the roundabout way home, letting the rhythms of the village and the snippets of overheard gossip settle in her mind. Passing the Ashworth house, a handsome but slightly forbidding structure, she paused, admiring the last of Cordelia's roses. As she did, a flicker of movement at an upstairs window caught her eye. For the briefest moment, she saw the unmistakable silhouette of the mysterious young woman, her face turned away before the curtain fell back into place and the window was empty. Miss Marple stood for a moment, thoughtful. The presence of the girl in the Ashworth house suggested a connection far more intimate than mere chance. She recalled the inscription on the back of the photograph, "Our darling Clara," and considered the resemblance between the child and the woman she had just seen. The incident with the glove, the burns on her wrist, the anxious reclaiming of the photograph. Each detail hinted at a story yet untold. As she resumed her walk, the rich tapestry of village life unfolded around her, gossiping neighbors, guarded glances, and the subtle shifting of allegiances and suspicions. The secrets of St. Mary Mead were beginning to surface, drawn forth by death, grief, and the sudden, jarring laughter of a stranger at a funeral. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and unassuming presence, found herself at the heart of a puzzle that promised, in time, to reveal the hidden truths of human nature and the quiet desperation that sometimes lay beneath the surface of even the most peaceful English village. That evening, in the privacy of her sitting room, Miss Marple took out the photograph and the glove, laying them side by side as she sipped her tea and listened to the distant tolling of the church bell. There were patterns here, familiar patterns of loss and longing, of secrets kept and revealed. And as she gazed thoughtfully at the faces in the photograph, she knew that the first faint outlines of the truth were beginning to emerge. The morning after the funeral brought one of those crisp September days that seemed to sharpen every detail of village life, from the precise geometry of Mrs. Price Ridley's garden borders to the way the light caught the brass nameplate on Dr. Haydock's surgery door. Miss Marple, who had spent a restless night contemplating the photograph and glove that now rested on her sitting-room table, decided that a constitutional walk might prove beneficial to both her circulation and her understanding of recent events. Her first stop, as was often the case when seeking to understand the undercurrents of village life, was the post office. Mrs. Baker, already presiding over her domain with the efficiency of a general commanding troops, greeted Miss Marple with the particular brightness that indicated she had news to share. The morning's routine business, stamps, postal orders, and the collection of Mrs. Clement's weekly parcel from her sister in Devon provided the perfect cover for more interesting conversation. "Such a lovely service yesterday," Miss Marple observed, counting out coins for her stamps with deliberate care. "Though I couldn't help noticing that young woman, the one with the dark hair. Not from the village, I think." Mrs. Baker's eyes lit with the pleasure of being consulted on a matter of local intelligence. "Indeed not, Miss Marple. Arrived only 3 days ago, she did, with a small suitcase and a very determined manner. Went straight to the Ashworth house, bold as brass, though I understand there was quite a scene when Mr. Jeffrey discovered her presence." She leaned closer, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial whisper that indicated truly significant information. "And speaking of scenes, you'll never guess what happened just the week before poor Mrs. Ashworth passed. She dismissed her companion, Miss Finch, after nearly 2 years of faithful service, mind you, over some trifling matter involving an ivory box." Miss Marple's expression remained one of polite interest, though her mind filed this information with considerable care. An ivory box? How very particular. One would think such small disagreements might be easily resolved. "You'd think so, wouldn't you?" Mrs. Baker agreed, warming to her theme. But according to Mrs. Daintree, who heard it from her daily woman who does for the Ashworths twice a week, there was shouting and carrying on something dreadful. Miss Finch claimed the box had gone missing. Mrs. Ashworth accused her of prying into private matters, and before you could say Jack Robinson, the poor woman was packing her bags. Most unlike Mrs. Ashworth, who was always so particular about proper behavior. As Miss Marple made her way from the post office, she reflected on this. Intelligence. The timing of Miss Finch's dismissal, so close to Mrs. Ashworth's death and the mysterious Clara's arrival, suggested connections that merited careful consideration. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sight of Dr. Haydock emerging from his surgery, his usually cheerful countenance marked by an expression of professional concern. "Good morning, Doctor," she called, adjusting her pace to intersect with his path. "I hope you're not dealing with anything too troubling on such a lovely morning." Dr. Haydock paused, seeming almost relieved to have someone to speak with. "Miss Marple, I'm glad to see you. I've just been reviewing my notes on poor Mrs. Ashworth, and I find myself rather troubled by certain aspects of her final illness." He glanced around, ensuring their conversation remained private. "You know, I prescribed a mild sedative for her nerves just a fortnight ago. She'd been quite agitated, according to Miss Finch, though the companion was dismissed before I could learn more about what was troubling her patient." "Agitated?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "That seems unlike Mrs. Ashworth. She always struck me as a woman of considerable composure." "Precisely my thought," Dr. Haydock agreed. Miss Finch mentioned that her employer had become quite secretive, hiding things about the house and expressing concerns about family matters. "When I examined Mrs. Ashworth after her death, everything seemed consistent with heart failure, but the rapidity of it—" He shook his head. "Perhaps I'm being overly cautious, but something about the whole business sits uneasily with me." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of young David Tremaine, who appeared to be making his way toward the Ashworth house with a leather portfolio under his arm. His usual confident bearing seemed somewhat diminished, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze kept drifting toward the upper windows of the house, as if expecting to see something or someone there. "Good morning, Mr. Tremaine," she called pleasantly. "I hope you're not finding the settlement of Mrs. Ashworth's affairs too burdensome." David paused, his color rising slightly. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock. "No, not burdensome exactly, though there have been some unexpected complications." He hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. "I don't suppose either of you has met the young lady who's been staying at the house? Miss Vale, I believe her name is. She's made some rather extraordinary claims about her relationship to the deceased." Dr. Haydock's eyebrows rose. "Claims? What sort of claims?" "She insists she's Mrs. Ashworth's daughter," David said quietly. "Mr. Jeffrey is naturally quite upset by the suggestion, but she seems to have certain evidence that's difficult to dismiss entirely." Miss Marple absorbed this information with her characteristic calm, though her mind immediately connected it to the photograph in her handbag and the inscription about "Darling Clara." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves into a recognizable pattern, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. After David continued on his way, Miss Marple excused herself from Dr. Haydock and made her way home via a route that happened to take her past the Ashworth house. As she paused to admire the late roses still blooming in the front garden, she became aware of voices from within, not raised in anger, but carrying the particular tension that comes from difficult conversations about delicate matters. Through the partially open morning room window, she could hear Geoffrey Ashworth's voice, controlled but strained. "I simply cannot accept such a preposterous claim without substantial proof. My aunt was a woman of the highest moral character, and to suggest otherwise." A younger woman's voice, calm but determined, replied, "I understand your shock, Mr. Ashworth, but I have letters, photographs, and other items that belong to my mother. She may have chosen to keep my existence secret, but that doesn't make me any less her daughter." Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind working with the methodical precision she brought to her most challenging knitting patterns. The glove in her handbag, with its faint scent of violets and what she now suspected might be an embroidered initial, suddenly seemed far more significant. If Clara Vale was indeed Mrs. Ashworth's daughter, given away in infancy and recently returned, it would explain much about the deceased woman's final agitation and the mysterious dismissal of her companion. As she reached her own gate, Miss Marple paused to consider the various threads of information she had gathered. The ivory box that had caused such trouble between Mrs. Ashworth and Miss Finch, the sedative prescribed for sudden nervousness, the arrival of a young woman claiming to be a long-lost daughter, and the curious timing of it all created a pattern that suggested far more complexity than a simple case of natural death and family reunion. The afternoon post brought an unexpected development in the form of a brief note from Rosalind Ashworth, written in a young hand that trembled slightly. "Dear Miss Marple, I wonder if you might call this afternoon. I should very much like to speak with someone who might understand about family secrets and the terrible burden they can place on those who must keep them." Miss Marple set down the note with a thoughtful expression. The girl's words suggested that whatever secrets the Ashworth family harbored, they extended beyond the simple matter of Clara Vale's parentage. As she prepared for her afternoon visit, she reflected that in her long experience of human nature, family secrets rarely traveled alone. They tended to cluster together like storm clouds, creating atmospheric conditions ripe for the most unexpected and often tragic consequences. The stage was set for revelations that would undoubtedly prove far more complex than anyone in St. Mary Mead yet suspected. The afternoon found Miss Marple walking the familiar path to the Ashworth house, her small offering of plum jam tucked discreetly in her basket, the sort of thoughtful gesture that opened doors without seeming to pry. The house itself seemed to exhale tension, as if the very walls had absorbed the strain of recent events. Patricia Ashworth answered the door personally, her usual composure slightly frayed at the edges, her smile both welcoming and wary. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful," Patricia said, accepting the jam with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "It's been such a difficult time. Geoffrey is with Mr. Tremaine. Legal matters, you understand. We seem to be quite besieged with complications." The morning room, where Patricia led her, carried the faint scent of roses past their prime, petals scattered on the mahogany table like teardrops. Miss Marple's observant eyes took in the details others might miss: an embroidery hoop abandoned mid-stitch, a pair of grey kid gloves with violet ribbon trim lying forgotten on the side table, and most tellingly, a faint dusting of ivory-coloured powder near the silver bell on the mantelpiece. "I believe Rosalind wished to speak with me," Miss Marple said gently, noting how Patricia's fingers worried at her handkerchief. "Yes, of course. She's in the garden. It seems to calm her nerves." Patricia's voice carried the particular strain of a woman trying to maintain normalcy when everything familiar was shifting beneath her feet. Rosalind was indeed in the garden, seated on the stone bench beneath the pear tree, her young face bearing the weight of adult secrets she was ill-equipped to carry. She rose when she saw Miss Marple, relief flooding her features with the transparent gratitude of youth. "You came," she said simply. I wasn't certain you would, but I remembered how kind you were during Mrs. Bantry's troubles, and I thought perhaps you might understand about family secrets." Miss Marple settled beside her, her presence immediately calming. "My dear child, secrets have a way of becoming heavier the longer they're carried alone. Sometimes sharing the burden makes it more manageable." Rosalind nodded, gathering her courage. "It's about Aunt Cordelia and Clara, Miss Vale, and the ivory box that caused such trouble with Miss Finch." Her words came in a rush, as if she feared losing her nerve. "Clara showed us letters yesterday evening, Miss Marple. Love letters in Aunt Cordelia's handwriting, addressed to a man named Thomas Vale. They spoke of their child, their precious Clara, with such tenderness. Father insists they're forgeries, but I've seen Aunt's writing all my life." Miss Marple absorbed this information while maintaining her expression of gentle interest. The photograph in her handbag suddenly seemed to carry even greater significance. "And how did Miss Vale come to possess these letters?" "She says she found them among her adoptive mother's effects when she died last month. Apparently, Mrs. Vale, not her real mother, but the woman who raised her, had been receiving regular payments from Aunt Cordelia for years, sent through a London solicitor with instructions that Clara was never to know the source until both women were dead. The complexity of such an arrangement spoke of deep emotion and careful planning. Miss Marple found herself thinking of Dr. Haydock's concerns about Mrs. Ashworth's final agitation. "Your aunt was troubled in her last weeks, I understand. Did she speak of what was worrying her?" Rosalind's eyes filled with tears. She kept speaking of things that couldn't be undone but ought to be brought into the light, and she became so secretive about that ivory box, the one she'd treasured for years. She called it her memory box, and always kept it locked away, but just before she died, she had that terrible quarrel with Miss Finch about it." "What sort of quarrel?" "Miss Finch said the box had gone missing, then claimed she'd found it again. Aunt Cordelia accused her of reading private letters, of prying into matters that weren't her concern. It was dreadful. I'd never seen Aunt so angry. Miss Finch was dismissed that very day, though I think Aunt regretted it afterward." Miss Marple's mind worked methodically, connecting threads. "And this box, have you seen it since your aunt's death?" Rosalind shook her head miserably. "That's just it. No one can find it. Father says it's probably just misplaced, but I think it might contain more evidence about Clara. She believes there should be more letters, perhaps even legal documents about her birth." Their conversation was interrupted by voices from the house. Geoffrey Ashworth's measured tones contrasting sharply with a woman's voice carrying barely controlled frustration. Through the open French doors they could hear Clara Vale speaking with determined politeness. "I understand your position, Mr. Ashworth, but surely you must see that ignoring the truth won't make it disappear. I didn't come here to cause trouble, but I have every right to know about my mother." "Rights." Geoffrey's voice rose. "You arrive uninvited at my aunt's funeral, make extraordinary claims, and speak of rights. I'm afraid I must ask you to leave this house immediately." The voices grew closer, and soon both speakers appeared on the terrace. Clara stopped when she saw Miss Marple, recognition flickering across her features, no doubt remembering their brief encounter at the church. Geoffrey seemed torn between embarrassment at having his private affairs overheard and relief at having a witness to what he clearly considered Clara's unreasonable behavior. "Miss Marple," Geoffrey said stiffly, "I apologize for this disturbance. Miss Vale was just leaving." But Clara, far from appearing defeated, straightened with renewed determination. "Actually, Mr. Ashworth, I think Miss Marple might be exactly the person we need. She has a reputation for understanding complicated family matters." She turned to Miss Marple with a direct gaze that spoke of considerable courage. "I wonder if you might be willing to examine some documents I've brought. An impartial observer might be able to confirm their authenticity." Miss Marple found herself at the center of a family drama, revealing layers of complexity she had only begun to suspect. Through the upstairs window, she glimpsed Patricia Ashworth's pale face, her hand gripping the banister with obvious tension. The woman's expression suggested fears that went far beyond mere social embarrassment. "I should be happy to look at anything you think might be helpful," Miss Marple said diplomatically, "though I should warn you that family secrets often reveal more than their keepers initially intended." As Clara moved to retrieve her leather portfolio, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's revelations. The ivory box remained the key to everything, its contents, its mysterious disappearance, and the violent quarrel that had preceded Mrs. Ashworth's death. Whatever secrets it held, they were significant enough to drive a dying woman to desperate measures and to bring a long-lost daughter home at precisely the moment when the truth could no longer be contained. The afternoon was about to become considerably more interesting. Clara's leather portfolio opened with a soft creak that seemed to echo through the suddenly still afternoon air. The documents within were arranged with the careful precision of someone who had spent considerable time organizing evidence for a moment she both dreaded and longed for. Miss Marple, invited to examine the papers with a gesture from Patricia that betrayed more nervousness than hospitality, settled her spectacles and began her methodical review. The letters, yellowed with age but preserved with obvious care, bore the unmistakable characteristics of Cordelia Ashworth's handwriting. The distinctive flourish of her capital C's, the particular way she crossed her T's, details Miss Marple remembered from countless charity committee notices over the years. The paper itself told its own story, bearing the watermark of a quality stationer and the faint, persistent scent of violets that had been Cordelia's signature fragrance for decades. "My dearest Thomas," one letter began, dated some 26 years past, "our precious Clara grows more beautiful each day. Mrs. Vale writes that she has your eyes and my stubborn determination. How I long to hold her, but I know this arrangement protects her from the scandal that would otherwise shadow her entire life." The emotion in the carefully formed words was unmistakable, carrying the weight of a mother's love constrained by social necessity. Geoffrey Ashworth stood rigid throughout Miss Marple's examination, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. Even if these letters are genuine, which I categorically deny, they prove nothing about this woman's identity. Such documents could have been acquired through any number of means. But Clara had more to offer. From the portfolio, she produced a small silver locket of exquisite craftsmanship, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. "This was with the letters," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional cost of these revelations. "Inside, there's a photograph of Mrs. Ashworth and a lock of baby's hair that matches my own." Miss Marple accepted the locket with gentle hands, immediately noting its weight and the distinctive style of its silverwork. The photograph inside showed a radiant young Cordelia, holding an infant, her face transformed by maternal joy. The resemblance between the baby and Clara was striking, but more compelling still was the inscription engraved inside. "To my darling Clara, with all my love. Mother." The sound of approaching footsteps announced David Tremaine's arrival, his legal portfolio clutched under his arm and his young face bearing an expression of considerable gravity. "Mr. Ashworth," he began without preamble, "I've completed my review of your aunt's papers, and there are matters of urgent importance we must discuss." "Not now, David," Geoffrey said curtly, but the young solicitor pressed on with the determination of someone bearing news that could not wait. "I'm afraid this is directly relevant," David replied, his gaze encompassing the documents spread across the table. "Your aunt's will contains provisions I hadn't fully understood until now. There's a substantial trust fund established years ago, designated specifically for my natural daughter, Clara Vale, should she present herself with proper identification within 1 year of my passing." The silence that followed this revelation was profound and telling. Geoffrey seemed to age before their eyes, while Patricia gripped the back of a garden chair as if she might faint. Clara's composure finally cracked, tears flowing not from triumph but from the bitter-sweet confirmation of a truth she had carried in her heart, but never dared hope to prove. Miss Marple, observing these reactions with her characteristic attention to human nature, noticed something others had missed. Patricia's response to the locket had been one of recognition rather than surprise. The woman's hand had moved instinctively toward her throat, where a thin chain disappeared beneath her high collar, a gesture that suggested familiarity with similar jewelry. "The craftsmanship is quite distinctive," Miss Marple observed mildly, still examining the locket. "The silverwork has a particular style that speaks of considerable skill. I believe Mr. Hartwell in the village used to create similar pieces, though that was many years ago." Patricia's color drained at this seemingly innocent observation, and she took an involuntary step backward. Her reaction seemed disproportionate unless she possessed knowledge that made Clara's claims more threatening than they initially appeared. Dr. Haydock chose that moment to appear at the garden gate, his expression troubled. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," he said, "but I've been reconsidering certain aspects of Mrs. Ashworth's final illness, and I wondered if I might speak with the family about my concerns." "Doctor," Geoffrey began, but Dr. Haydock continued with the authority of his profession. "I've been reviewing my notes on Mrs. Ashworth's condition in her final weeks. The agitation, the secretiveness, the sudden dismissal of her companion. These symptoms suggest she was under considerable emotional strain. Given what I'm seeing here today, I believe she may have been preparing for Clara's arrival." Miss Marple found herself studying Patricia with renewed interest. The woman's reaction to Dr. Haydock's words carried a flash of something that might have been fear or guilt before her features resumed their careful mask of concern. There were undercurrents here that went far beyond the simple matter of Clara's parentage. "There's still the question of the ivory box," Rosalind said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the tension. "If Aunt Cordelia was preparing for Clara's arrival, surely it would contain additional evidence. But no one has been able to find it since her death." Dr. Haydock's expression sharpened with interest. "Ah, yes, the box she was so concerned about in her final days. She mentioned it during my last visit, said it contained things that would set the record straight when the time was right." The implications of this statement settled over the group like a chill. If Mrs. Ashworth had indeed prepared evidence for Clara's arrival, preserving it in her treasured ivory box, then its mysterious disappearance took on far more sinister significance. Someone had clearly gone to considerable lengths to ensure that particular evidence would never see the light of day. Miss Marple's gaze moved thoughtfully from face to face, noting the various expressions of shock, fear, and calculation that the afternoon's revelations had produced. Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt, and Miss Marple noticed for the first time the faint dusting of pale powder on the woman's gloves, the same tone as the residue she had observed on Clara's letter. As the shadows lengthened across the garden, Miss Marple reflected that, in her long experience of human nature, the most dangerous secrets were often those that multiple people shared. The peaceful afternoon had revealed layers of deception and hidden knowledge that suggested the truth about Cordelia Ashworth's death was far more complex than anyone had initially suspected. The stage was set for revelations that would prove far more shocking than a simple case of long-lost parentage, and Miss Marple sensed that the most crucial discoveries lay just ahead. The silence that followed David Tremaine's announcement about the trust fund seemed to stretch across the garden like a shadow, each person processing the implications in their own way. Miss Marple, observing the various reactions with her characteristic attention to detail, noted how Patricia's hand had moved instinctively to smooth her skirt, a gesture she had repeated several times throughout the afternoon, leaving faint traces of something powdery on the dark fabric. Geoffrey's composure finally cracked completely. "This is nothing short of blackmail," he declared, his voice rising to a pitch that carried across the neighboring gardens. My aunt was a woman of impeccable character, and I will not stand by while opportunists exploit her death for financial gain. These documents are forgeries, and this woman is an impostor." But David, despite his youth, possessed the steady determination that comes from dealing with legal facts rather than emotional protests. "Mr. Ashworth, I understand your shock, but the will was properly witnessed and filed. Moreover, there's another provision I haven't yet mentioned. Your aunt specifically bequeathed to Clara the ivory memory box and all its contents, that she might understand the full truth of her origins." The impact of this revelation was immediate and telling. Clara herself looked genuinely surprised, her hand moving unconsciously to the silver locket at her throat. Geoffrey's face flushed with what might have been anger or fear, while Patricia rose abruptly from her chair, murmuring something about checking on tea preparations. Miss Marple noted with interest that Patricia's departure came at precisely the moment when the ivory box was mentioned, the same box that had caused such terrible discord between Mrs. Ashworth and her dismissed companion. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening with growing concern, stepped forward with the authority of his profession. "I'm afraid I must speak plainly," he said, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by grave professionalism. Mrs. Ashworth's condition in her final weeks was not consistent with simple heart failure. She was agitated, secretive, and spoke repeatedly of setting things right before it was too late. Given what we've learned today about Clara's existence and the provisions in the will, I believe Mrs. Ashworth was preparing for this reunion while simultaneously protecting evidence of their relationship. The doctor's words carried implications that none of them could ignore. Miss Marple found herself studying Clara's face, noting the genuine grief that shadowed the young woman's features. Whatever Clara's motivations, her sorrow at never knowing her birth mother appeared entirely authentic. "You're suggesting my aunt's death was not natural?" Geoffrey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm suggesting," Dr. Haydock replied carefully, "that the circumstances warrant investigation. The sudden onset of her final illness, the mysterious disappearance of the ivory box she treasured, and the timing of Clara's arrival create a pattern that cannot be ignored." As if summoned by the gravity of the Iowa situation, Constable Davies appeared at the garden gate, his solid presence lending official weight to what had begun as a private family matter. His arrival had been prompted by Mrs. Price Ridley, who had received a garbled account of the afternoon's events from her gardener and concluded that such dramatic revelations required immediate police attention. The constable's methodical approach to taking statements revealed the limitations of his usual experience with lost property and minor disputes. His focus immediately settled on Geoffrey as the obvious suspect, the nephew who stood to lose his inheritance to a mysterious claimant who had appeared at precisely the right moment. Miss Marple observed this development with the patient interest she might give to a particularly predictable knitting pattern, knowing that obvious solutions in St. Mary Mead were rarely the correct ones. While Constable Davies interviewed the various parties, Miss Marple found herself drawn to examine the documents Clara had presented more closely. The letters bore all the hallmarks of authenticity: the watermark, the fading of the ink, the particular way Mrs. Ashworth formed her letters. But more intriguingly, she noticed a faint, pearlescent residue along the edges of several pages, as if they had been handled by someone whose fingers carried traces of face powder. Patricia's return from the house provided another piece of the puzzle. The woman's gloves, Miss Marple observed, bore the same faint dusting of powder, and when Patricia nervously smoothed her skirt once again, she left similar traces on the dark fabric. It was a small detail, the sort that might escape official notice, but Miss Marple had learned that such minor inconsistencies often pointed toward larger truths. As the afternoon wore on and the constable completed his preliminary investigation, Miss Marple excused herself with the gentle courtesy that made her presence seem both unremarkable and welcome. Her route home took her past the morning room window, where she paused to admire the late roses still blooming in the border. Through the partially open casement, she caught a glimpse of the room's interior, and noticed a small silver pot on the mantelpiece, its contents the same pearlescent powder she'd observed on Patricia's gloves and Clara's documents. The detail was so subtle, so easily overlooked, that she felt certain Constable Davies would miss its significance entirely. But to Miss Marple, it represented a connection that extended beyond mere coincidence. Someone had been handling both Clara's precious letters and that particular cosmetic, creating a trail of evidence that spoke of secret examinations and hidden knowledge. That evening, as she settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The police had their obvious suspect in Geoffrey, whose motives were clear and whose protests seemed to confirm his guilt. But the pearlescent powder trail suggested a different story entirely, one involving someone who had access to both the Ashworth house and Clara's most precious possessions. The morning brought news that transformed the entire complexion of the case. Miss Finch, the dismissed companion, had been found collapsed in her lodgings in Much Benham, clutching a torn envelope with Ashworth scrawled across its front. She was alive, but in a state of shock that prevented coherent speech, her condition suggesting she had received news that had terrified her beyond endurance. Miss Marple, learning of this development from Mrs. Baker at the post office, felt the familiar stirring of certainty that came when the pieces of a puzzle began to align. Miss Finch's collapse, the missing ivory box, and the pearlescent powder trail were all connected. She was sure of it. The question now was whether the truth would emerge before someone else paid the price for the secrets that had already claimed too many victims. The investigation was about to take a turn that would surprise everyone, except perhaps Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that in matters of family secrets and hidden guilt, the most dangerous person was often the one who seemed most concerned with maintaining appearances. The news of Miss Finch's collapse reached Miss Marple through the efficient network of village communication, arriving with Mrs. Baker's morning delivery of particulars that seemed to multiply with each telling. By the time Miss Marple had gathered her coat and made her way to Much Benham, the former companion had regained enough composure to speak, though her words came in fragmented whispers that required careful interpretation. Dr. Haydock, who had accompanied Miss Marple on this mission of mercy, found Miss Finch's physical condition stable but her mental state deeply troubled. The woman clutched a torn envelope bearing Ashworth in bold script, her fingers refusing to release what appeared to be her final connection to the household that had dismissed her so abruptly. When Miss Marple gently encouraged her to speak, Miss Finch's account emerged in halting phrases that painted a picture of mounting terror. "The box was moved," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. "Not where she kept it, but hidden away. I found it in the summer house, but someone else was there, watching. They knew I'd discovered it." Her voice dropped to barely audible levels. "The bell, Miss Marple, it's not what it seems. There's something underneath, something that changes everything." With trembling hands, Miss Finch produced a small item wrapped in her handkerchief. A cloakroom ticket from Much Benham Station, numbered 417 in faded pencil. "I managed to hide this before they saw me. It's what Mrs. Ashworth gave me the day before she died, when she was so agitated. She said if anything happened, I should keep it safe for her daughter." The station master, recognizing Miss Marple from her occasional trips to visit her nephew, produced the corresponding parcel without question. Inside the brown paper wrapping lay a small, ornate key with an ivory tag, shaped like a delicate bell, accompanied by a note in Miss Finch's careful script. "Not safe at house. Box moved. Keep for sea. The truth must come out." Miss Marple examined the key with the same attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. The ivory work was exquisite, clearly crafted to match something specific, and the bell shape seemed to echo details she had observed in the Ashworth morning room. The pearlescent residue she had been tracking appeared here too, faint but unmistakable on the key's surface. Returning to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found the Ashworth household in a state of barely controlled chaos. Patricia answered the door with the brittle composure of someone balancing on the edge of revelation, her gloved hands leaving those now familiar traces of powder on everything she touched. The morning room, when Miss Marple was admitted, bore signs of recent disturbance, papers hastily straightened, surfaces polished to unusual brightness, and the silver bell on the mantelpiece gleaming as if newly cleaned. Clara sat by the window, her face pale but determined, clutching what appeared to be a small leather-bound volume. "Miss Marple," she said, rising with obvious relief, "I'm so glad you've come. Something extraordinary has happened, though I'm not certain whether it's a blessing or another complication." The volume proved to be a diary in Mrs. Ashworth's unmistakable handwriting, its final entries dating to the days immediately before her death. Clara's explanation of its discovery, tucked into a drawer she had previously searched thoroughly, carried an undertone of bewilderment that suggested the diary's placement had been deliberate rather than accidental. "The last entry mentions the ivory box specifically," Clara continued, opening to a page marked with a violet ribbon. "She writes about a terrible truth that must come to light, something that concerns not just my parentage, but a secret that would shatter lives in St. Mary Mead." The entry breaks off suddenly, as if she were interrupted. Miss Marple accepted the diary with careful hands, noting immediately the faint dusting of pearlescent powder on its leather cover, the same substance that had been appearing with increasing frequency throughout their investigation. The handwriting was undoubtedly authentic, but the convenient timing of the diary's appearance suggested someone was carefully orchestrating the flow of information. Geoffrey entered at that moment, his face flushed with anger and what might have been fear. "This is becoming intolerable," he declared, his voice rising to carry throughout the house. "First these supposed letters, now a conveniently discovered diary. How many more discoveries will there be, Miss Vale?" But Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something else entirely. The silver bell on the mantelpiece, which she had observed being cleaned so carefully, sat at a slightly different angle than before. More significantly, the wooden base beneath it showed faint scratches, as if the bell had been moved repeatedly. When she approached for a closer look, she noticed that the bell's base was not solid. There appeared to be a hairline crack that might indicate a hidden compartment. Patricia's sharp intake of breath confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. "The cleaning," Miss Marple murmured as if to herself. "Not for appearance, but for access. The pearlescent powder isn't from cosmetics at all, is it? It's from whatever was hidden beneath the bell." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Rosalind appeared in the doorway, her young face bearing the weight of adult secrets she could no longer carry alone. "Mother," she said quietly, "I think it's time to tell them about what you found under the bell the night Aunt Cordelia died." Patricia's composure finally began to crack, her carefully maintained facade crumbling like a house of cards in a sudden wind. The ivory key in Miss Marple's handbag seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, its significance expanding beyond mere access to a missing box. The bell, the powder, the carefully orchestrated discoveries all pointed toward a truth far more complex than simple family secrets. As the afternoon light slanted through the morning room windows, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous secrets were often hidden in the most obvious places, disguised by the very ordinariness of their surroundings. The silver bell had rung countless times over the years, summoning servants and marking the rhythms of daily life, never revealing that it harbored evidence that would ultimately expose a carefully planned deception. The stage was set for revelations that would prove far more shocking than anyone in St. Mary Mead had yet imagined, and Miss Marple sensed that the final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place with devastating clarity. Patricia's carefully maintained composure finally shattered at her daughter's quiet insistence, her hands flying to her throat as if she could no longer breathe under the weight of secrets she had carried alone. The silver bell on the mantelpiece seemed to mock her with its innocent gleam, and when she spoke, Her voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had rehearsed confessions in the dark hours before dawn. "The night Cordelia died," she whispered, sinking into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support her. She was not herself, agitated beyond anything I had ever seen, speaking in fragments about bells and hidden truths and the terrible price of old lies. She made me promise, made me swear on Rosalind's life, that if anything happened to her, I would look beneath the bell. She said the truth was hidden within the chime, and that it must be protected until the right person came to claim it. Miss Marple approached the mantelpiece with the gentle authority that had served her so well over the years, her keen eyes noting the faint scratches on the wooden base that spoke of recent, repeated handling. With careful fingers, she lifted the silver bell, revealing beneath it a shallow depression that had been invisible when the ornament sat in its customary position. The craftsmanship was exquisite, a hidden compartment so perfectly concealed that only someone who knew of its existence would think to look. "French chalk," Miss Marple observed mildly, noting the pearlescent residue that dusted the compartment's edges. "Servants once used it to prevent drawers from sticking. It leaves such a distinctive, pearl-like powder when disturbed." Her eyes met Patricia's with quiet understanding. "You found something here, didn't you, my dear?" Patricia nodded miserably, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. A small wooden box, plain, unremarkable, and a letter from Cordelia addressed to me. The letter spoke of terrible mistakes, of secrets that could destroy Geoffrey's reputation and our family's standing. She begged me to protect him, to ensure that certain truths never came to light. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I was so frightened. I took the box to the summer house, meaning to destroy it once everything had settled. But Clara, who had been listening with growing intensity, stepped forward with a determination that transformed her entire bearing. "A wooden box?" she asked, her voice sharp with sudden understanding. Miss Finch spoke of an ivory box, and she gave Miss Marple an ivory key. She turned to Miss Marple, her eyes bright with realization. "There were 2 boxes, weren't there? Someone wanted us to find the wrong one." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, pleased to see the young woman's quick intelligence at work. "Indeed, my dear. The pearlescent powder we have been tracking throughout our investigation is not from face powder, as I initially suspected, but from ivory, the fine dust created when ivory is handled roughly, perhaps forced open or moved with considerable urgency." The implications of this revelation settled over the room like a chill. Geoffrey, who had been growing increasingly pale throughout Patricia's confession, suddenly looked at his wife with an expression that mixed horror with dawning suspicion. Dr. Haydock, ever the medical man, was examining the residue in the hidden compartment with professional interest, while David Tremaine stood frozen in the doorway, his legal portfolio clutched against his chest like a shield. Before anyone could respond to these revelations, the sound of running footsteps came from the garden, followed by Rosalind's voice calling urgently from the direction of the summer house. The group moved as one toward the French doors, Patricia stumbling slightly as if the afternoon's confessions had drained her of all strength. In the octagonal summer house, they found evidence of recent, hasty activity. The iron brazier glowed with fresh embers, and the acrid scent of burned paper hung heavy in the air. Scattered across the small table were charred fragments bearing the unmistakable letterhead of Melchester and County Bank, while stuffed into the neck of a dented paraffin can was a handkerchief, scorched at the edges and bearing an embroidered initial that could have been either a P or an R, worked in an old-fashioned hand. "Someone has been here within the hour," Miss Marple observed, using a pair of tongs to lift a larger fragment from the brazier. The paper bore part of an official seal and the words, "In the event of my death, to be opened by," before the text disappeared into charred ruin. David Tremaine's face had gone ashen as he recognized the bank's letterhead. "There was an attempt this morning," he said quietly, his voice strained with implications he was only beginning to understand. Someone presented a letter purporting to be from Mrs. Ashworth, authorizing access to her safe deposit box. The signature was questioned, and the manager refused. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the methodical precision she brought to her most complex knitting patterns. The burned papers, the hasty flight, the attempted bank fraud, all pointed to someone who knew about Mrs. Ashworth's arrangements but lacked the proper authorization to access them legally. Someone who had been watching, waiting, and growing increasingly desperate as Clara's arrival threatened to expose carefully hidden truths. As Constable Davies arrived, summoned by the smoke that had been visible from the village, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's revelations. 2 boxes, 2 keys, and an elaborate deception designed to misdirect attention from the real evidence. Patricia's wooden box was likely a decoy, placed to satisfy anyone who came looking, while the real ivory box, the one Miss Finch had tried so desperately to protect, contained evidence that someone was willing to commit fraud and arson to destroy. The pearlescent powder told its own story of forced entry and desperate searching, while the burned papers in the summer house spoke of someone who had finally located what they sought, but found themselves unable to access it through legal means. The handkerchief, with its ambiguous initial, suggested someone who had been careless in their haste, a detail that would prove crucial when the time came for final revelations. As the shadows lengthened across the garden and Constable Davies began his methodical documentation of the scene, Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous phase of their investigation was about to begin. The killer had been flushed from cover by the afternoon's discoveries, and desperate people, in her long experience, were capable of the most extreme measures to protect their secrets. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would test not only her powers of deduction, but her understanding of the lengths to which ordinary people would go when faced with the complete destruction of everything they held dear. The discovery in the summer house cast a shadow over the Ashworth household that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. Constable Davies, methodical in his approach to collecting the charred fragments and the singed handkerchief, made careful notes, while Miss Marple observed the various reactions with her characteristic attention to human nature. Geoffrey stood rigid by the French doors, his earlier bluster replaced by a stunned silence that spoke of dawning comprehension. Patricia remained near the mantelpiece, her gloved hands worrying at her skirt in that familiar gesture that had been leaving its pearlescent trail throughout their investigation. The handkerchief, with its delicate embroidery, provided a crucial detail that Miss Marple filed away with particular care. The initial worked in an old-fashioned hand could be interpreted as either a P or an R, pointing toward either Patricia or Rosalind. But the sophistication of the deception, the careful timing of the document burning, and the desperate attempt at bank fraud all suggested a more mature hand, someone accustomed to managing appearances and protecting family secrets. Miss Marple excused herself from the immediate chaos, making her way to Much Benham with Dr. Haydock for a second visit to Miss Finch. The former companion, though still pale from her earlier collapse, had regained enough composure to provide information that transformed their understanding of Mrs. Ashworth's final days. "I've remembered something crucial," Miss Finch said, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional cost of the recollection. "The morning Mrs. Ashworth died, she received a visitor very early, before the household was properly awake. I heard voices from the morning room, one of them raised in what seemed to be argument. When I came down later, the visitor had gone, but Mrs. Ashworth was in a terrible state." Miss Finch's hands trembled slightly as she continued. "She kept saying that someone had forced her hand, and that the truth would have to come out sooner than she had planned. But what frightened me most was what she said about the bell, that someone else knew about the hiding place, someone who had no right to that knowledge." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. "Did you see this early visitor?" "Only a glimpse from the upstairs window as they left," Miss Finch replied. "Someone in a dark coat with the collar turned up. But I did notice they walked with a particular gait, favoring the left foot slightly, as if from an old injury." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant, adding another piece to the complex puzzle that was beginning to reveal its true pattern. As they returned to St. Mary Mead through the gathering dusk, she found herself reviewing the various people she had observed throughout the investigation, noting their movements and mannerisms with methodical precision. Back at the Ashworth house, Miss Marple settled into what appeared to be a casual visit, but was actually a carefully orchestrated psychological test. Patricia, attempting to arrange flowers with hands that betrayed her inner turmoil, provided the perfect opportunity for Miss Marple's gentle but relentless probing. "Such dreadful business yesterday," Miss Marple began, accepting a cup of tea with her usual courtesy. "Though I dare say the most significant discoveries are yet to come. It's curious how a simple object can hold such power over people's actions. That ivory box, for instance. Poor Miss Finch was quite distraught by its disappearance, believing it held the key to more than just Clara's parentage." Patricia's hands faltered with the rose stem she was holding, the flower dropping to scatter petals across the polished table. "Cordelia was always sentimental about her possessions," she murmured, her voice carefully controlled. "Indeed," Miss Marple continued, her tone deceptively mild. "And yet the contents seem to have been rather more significant than mere sentiment. The early morning visitor Miss Finch mentioned, the argument that followed, the desperate attempt to burn bank documents, all suggest someone was terrified of what that box might reveal." She watched Patricia closely, noting the tightening of her jaw, the way her breath caught slightly at the mention of the early morning visitor. Rosalind, sketching nearby, had gone very still, her pencil suspended above the paper as if she too sensed the dangerous undercurrents in the conversation. "The handkerchief found in the summer house was particularly interesting," Miss Marple observed, stirring her tea with deliberate care. "Such beautiful embroidery, the sort of needlework that speaks of careful training and considerable skill. The initial was worked in a style that suggests someone who learned their stitches many years ago, when such attention to detail was considered essential for a young lady's education." Patricia's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with trembling hands. The pearlescent residue Miss Marple had been tracking throughout their investigation seemed more pronounced now, as if Patricia's nervous movements were disturbing whatever substance created that distinctive powder. "One might almost think," Miss Marple mused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that someone very close to Mrs. Ashworth knew exactly what that ivory box contained and was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to prevent its contents from coming to light. The sort of lengths that might include early morning visits, heated arguments, and ultimately desperate measures to destroy evidence." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Patricia's breathing had become shallow, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to maintain her composure. Her eyes darted around the room as if seeking escape, while her hands continued, their nervous smoothing motion leaving more traces of that telltale powder on her dark skirt. Miss Marple set down her teacup with gentle finality, her keen blue eyes never leaving Patricia's face. The psychological trap had been set with characteristic subtlety, and the reaction it produced confirmed what she had long suspected. The truth was finally within reach, waiting only for the right moment to emerge with devastating clarity. The stage was set for the final revelation that would expose not just the identity of Mrs. Ashworth's killer, but the complex web of family secrets and desperate measures that had led to murder in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. The weight of Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable questioning finally proved too much for Patricia's carefully maintained facade. Her hands stilled on her skirt, the familiar smoothing gesture ceasing as if she had suddenly realized how it betrayed her. The pearlescent residue that had marked her path throughout their investigation seemed to glitter accusingly in the afternoon light, each trace a silent witness to her desperate attempts to conceal the truth. "You knew about the ivory box long before Mrs. Ashworth's death, didn't you, my dear?" Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the inexorable certainty of flowing water. "The early morning visit Miss Finch witnessed wasn't a stranger at all. It was you, arriving before the household was awake to confront Mrs. Ashworth about what you had discovered. Patricia's breathing became labored, her chest rising and falling with the effort of maintaining composure that was rapidly disintegrating. Rosalind, still frozen with her pencil suspended above her sketching pad, watched her mother with growing horror as the implications of Miss Marple's words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. The ivory box contained more than just evidence of Clara's parentage, Miss Marple observed, her keen eyes never leaving Patricia's face. It held documents that would expose Geoffrey's financial irregularities from years past, perhaps embezzlement, perhaps fraud. Mrs. Ashworth had discovered these crimes, covered for him out of family loyalty, but intended to use Clara's arrival as the catalyst to finally make restitution and ensure justice was served. Geoffrey himself appeared in the doorway at that moment, drawn by some instinct that told him his fate was being decided in the morning room. His face went ashen as he heard Miss Marple's words, his hand gripping the door frame as if he might fall without its support. "You found the box," Miss Marple continued, addressing Patricia with the gentle relentlessness that had solved countless mysteries over the years. "Perhaps while tidying Mrs. Ashworth's room, or during one of your visits to check on her health. You forced it open, hence the ivory dust that has clung to everything you've touched since, and discovered the full extent of what Mrs. Ashworth planned to reveal to Clara." Patricia's composure finally shattered completely. A sob escaped her, raw and desperate, as she buried her face in her hands. "She wouldn't listen," she whispered, her voice muffled by her gloves. "I begged her to consider what it would do to Geoffrey, to Rosalind, to our entire family, but she was determined that Clara should know the truth, that justice should finally be served." The confession poured out in broken fragments, each revelation more damning than the last. Patricia had indeed been the early morning visitor who had so frightened Miss Finch. She had pleaded with Mrs. Ashworth to reconsider her plans, to think of the scandal that would destroy not just Geoffrey but innocent Rosalind as well. When Mrs. Ashworth remained adamant that the truth must come to light, Patricia had seen only one solution to protect everything she held dear. "Her heart was already weak," Patricia continued, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Haydock had prescribed sedatives for her agitation. In her distressed state that morning, it would have been so easy to ensure she took more than the prescribed dose, or to substitute something stronger. I told myself it would look like natural death, a heart attack brought on by stress and advanced age." Dr. Haydock, who had arrived quietly during the confession, confirmed the plausibility of such a method. A substitution of medications or an overdose of sedatives would indeed have been virtually undetectable without specific testing, he said grimly. Mrs. Ashworth's known heart condition made her death appear entirely natural. The aftermath of Patricia's confession brought a mixture of relief and devastation to the Ashworth household. Geoffrey, learning for the first time the full extent of what his wife had done to protect him from his own past crimes, struggled to comprehend how their marriage had been built on such a foundation of deception and desperate measures. Rosalind, her young face aged by the terrible knowledge of her mother's crime, found herself caught between love and horror, loyalty and revulsion. As Constable Davies led Patricia away, her head bowed in shame and defeat, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of human nature that had led to such tragedy. The pearlescent powder that had been Patricia's undoing was indeed ivory dust, created when she had forced open Mrs. Ashworth's treasured memory box in her desperate search for evidence that would expose her family's secrets. Clara, the catalyst whose arrival had triggered these devastating revelations, received not only acknowledgement of her parentage, but also the ivory box that had caused so much tragedy. Its contents, beyond the incriminating financial documents, included a collection of letters from her birth mother that painted a picture of a woman torn between love and social convention, who had made the painful decision to give up her daughter to protect her from scandal. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its normal rhythms, though the Events surrounding Mrs. Ashworth's death had left their mark on everyone involved. Geoffrey withdrew from public life, overwhelmed by the destruction of everything he had believed about his marriage, and haunted by the knowledge that his past crimes had driven his wife to murder. Rosalind, with the resilience of youth, gradually began to rebuild her understanding of family and trust, finding solace in her growing friendship with David Tremaine. Clara remained in the village for several weeks, using the time to learn about the mother she had never known and to establish the relationships that her sudden appearance had made possible. The trust fund that Mrs. Ashworth had established provided her with financial security, but more importantly, it represented a mother's love that had transcended years of separation and social convention. Miss Marple, settling back into her quiet routine of knitting and village observation, found herself reflecting on the curious way that human nature revealed itself under pressure. Patricia's crime had grown from a desperate desire to protect her family into a web of deception that ultimately demanded the most extreme measures to maintain. The ivory box, meant to preserve precious memories and ensure justice was finally served, had become instead the catalyst for tragedy. As autumn settled more deeply over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple often thought about the girl who had laughed at the funeral, laughter that had seemed so inappropriate but had actually represented the complex emotions of someone finally learning the truth about her origins. In the end, Clara's arrival had brought justice for Mrs. Ashworth and exposed secrets that might otherwise have remained hidden forever, though at a cost that no one could have anticipated. The bells of St. Mary's Church continued to ring the hours, their clear notes carrying across the village as they had for generations. But Miss Marple, whenever she heard them, remembered another bell, the silver one that had hidden such devastating secrets beneath its innocent exterior, proving once again that in the quiet English countryside, the most ordinary objects often concealed the most extraordinary truths about the darkness that could lurk in human hearts when love became twisted by fear and desperation.